Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a story where a father silently listens outside a small house, unaware that every word spoken inside will change him forever. What happens when a son holds the power to destroy his own father, yet chooses mercy instead? Stay with us to uncover the moment where control collapses, truth awakens, and a father realizes he may lose his son forever. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Late afternoon settles quietly over the narrow dirt road leading to the small house. The light is fading, stretching shadows across the uneven ground, and the air feels heavier than it should. From a distance, Mr. Hoan stands still, not stepping forward right away, as if crossing that short stretch of road would require more courage than he expected. His tailored suit, sharp and immaculate, looks painfully out of place against the simple surroundings in front of him. He glances around slowly, cautiously, his eyes scanning the empty road and the neighboring houses. There is no sound, no movement, yet his body reacts as if he might be seen at any moment. His hand rises instinctively to his chest, pressing lightly as he forces his breathing to slow down, steadying himself. This was not how he imagined his son's life. Not like this, not here. He had expected something different, something guarded, something controlled. Instead, there is no tall gate, no fence, no sense of distance between the house and the world outside, no security waiting nearby, no sign of protection, just a modest structure standing quietly, its walls worn but intact, its presence unremarkable. A weak yellow light leaks softly from the window, trembling slightly as if unsure whether it should remain on. Mr. Hoan takes a few steps forward, then stops again. His polished shoes press into the dirt, leaving marks that feel too visible, too permanent. The contrast unsettles him. This place strips away status, power, and expectation, leaving only reality behind. For the first time, he realizes he has no idea who his son has become within these walls. He remains there, suspended between turning back and moving forward, uncertain which choice frightens him more. Just as Mr. Hoan lifts his hand, preparing to knock, a voice drifts out from inside the house. It slips through the thin walls and the half-open window, clear enough to stop him in place. The voice belongs to Fat, low, calm, each word articulated carefully, without hesitation, without emotion. The video is very clear, just bringing it out will be enough evidence. The sentence hangs in the air longer than it should. Mr. Hoan freezes. His raised hand stops midway, fingers stiff, hovering inches from the door. For a brief moment, he forgets how to breathe. The sound feels heavier than the silence that came before it, heavier than the road, the house, the fading light around him. He lowers his hand slowly, as if afraid the slightest movement might betray his presence. His heartbeat grows louder in his ears, pulsing in an uneven rhythm. One step back, then another. His body moves before his mind can catch up. He shifts toward the side of the house, pressing himself flat against the wall beside the window. The rough surface scrapes lightly against his sleeve, but he barely notices. All his attention narrows to the voices inside. The house no longer feels small. It feels sealed, dangerous, filled with words that should never reach him. He had come here unannounced, driven by impulse, by concern, by curiosity. Now, standing in the shadows, he realizes he has crossed into something he was never meant to hear. He holds his breath, listening, heart tight, mind racing, knowing that whatever comes next will not allow him to walk away unchanged. Inside the narrow space of the small house, James' voice reached Hoan through the thin wall, calm and steady yet carrying a weight that pressed heavily against the air. It was not the tone of anger or revenge, but the kind of quiet decision that comes after long nights of thinking. When James asked whether the evidence was enough to send him to prison, Hoan felt his heart slam hard against his chest. His breathing stalled for a moment, and the hand pressed to the wall tightened, as if the cold surface was the only thing keeping him upright. He had always imagined his son as someone who hesitated, who needed guidance, someone who would never stand at the edge of a choice this final. Yet here James was, speaking about prison, about evidence, about a future that could destroy his own father. Hoan realized with a sudden sharp clarity that this was not a threat spoken in emotion, but a question asked by a man who had already walked through his fear. The silence after the question stretched longer than Hoan expected. In that silence, he saw memories of James as a child standing behind him at formal events, learning when to speak and when to stay quiet. He heard his own voice from years ago telling the boy what was right, what was acceptable, what was forbidden. Now that same boy had grown into someone who understood consequences and was still willing to face them. Hoan felt something crack inside him, not loudly but deep and slow. He did not yet know what answer James would choose to give, but for the first time Hoan understood that the control he had held for so long was already slipping away. Standing there, listening in the shadow of the window, he finally accepted that his son was no longer asking for permission, but preparing to act on his own truth. Fat spoke again, his voice steady, cutting through the silence like a blade that did not need force to wound. "All it takes," Fat said quietly, "is a nod." Outside, Hoan stiffened. His back pressed harder against the wall, as if the house itself had shifted and trapped him there. He held his breath, afraid even the sound of it might leak inside. "A nod," Fat repeated. "That's it. Everything else is already prepared." There was no anger in Fat's tone, no urgency. That calm frightened Hoan more than shouting ever could. His fingers curled slowly, nails digging into his palm. He waited. James did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Hoan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. In that pause, his mind raced through images he could not stop. Police lights, courtrooms, his own name spoken by strangers, and above all, James sitting across from him, not as a son, but as someone who had made a final judgment. Inside the house, James finally spoke. "At first," James said, his voice rougher than before, "I thought that was the only way." Hoan's eyes widened slightly. His chest tightened. "I thought if I went through with it," James continued, "maybe everything would finally stop. The pressure, the damage, the control." Fat did not interrupt. He let James speak. "But now?" James paused. A breath. "Now I don't think like that anymore." Hoan frowned deeply, confusion washing over him. His heart pounded harder, not with relief, but with something closer to fear. Fat asked quietly, "Why?" James answered without raising his voice. "Because if I do that," James said, "then I become the same kind of person I'm trying to escape from." Outside, Hoan felt the words strike him directly. He swallowed hard. "I won't destroy someone just to prove I can," James went on, "even if that person deserves it." Fat exhaled slowly. "So you're choosing to walk away?" "I'm choosing to decide for myself," James replied. "That's all?" Another silence followed, heavier than the last. Hoan leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closing for a brief moment. His face tightened. In that instant, he understood something he had refused to see for years. This was not defiance. This was separation. His son was no longer standing against him. James was standing apart. Inside the house, James continued speaking. His voice did not rise, did not shake, but every sentence landed with a weight that Hoan could feel clearly through the wall. "No matter how wrong he is," James said slowly, "he is still my father." Hoan's body stiffened, his shoulders tensed as if the words had physically struck him. "If it weren't for him," James went on, "then I wouldn't even be here." Outside, Hoan's hand began to tremble uncontrollably. The cane he was holding slipped slightly and tapped against the hard ground, producing a dry, hollow sound. He froze, fearing the noise might give him away, but no one inside reacted. His breathing became uneven. James did not stop. "I can't pretend I don't know what he's done," James said. "I can't pretend it didn't hurt people. It hurt me too." Fat's voice came carefully. "Then why protect him?" James answered without hesitation. "Because destroying him won't fix what's broken." Hoan swallowed hard. His chest tightened painfully. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I'm not just an extension of him," James continued. "If I cross this line, then everything he taught me about power wins." Outside, Hoan felt fear crawl up his spine. Not fear of evidence, not fear of consequences, but fear of the choice his son was making right now, freely, without pressure, without control. "I won't use his mistakes as a weapon," James said. "I won't erase my own roots just to feel stronger." Fat remained silent. Hoan's grip on the cane loosened. His fingers shook visibly. For the first time in many years, he felt small, exposed, stripped of authority. This was not defiance spoken in anger. This was conviction shaped by pain. "I owe him my life," James concluded quietly. "That doesn't excuse him, but it means something." Hoan closed his eyes. His throat tightened, and for a brief moment, he felt something he had avoided for decades: shame. James lowered his voice, as if the words themselves required restraint. "Delete everything," he said. Fat looked up sharply. "What?" "All the videos," James repeated. "Every file, every copy." A brief silence followed. The air inside the room seemed to thicken. "You worked too hard for this," Fat said cautiously. "We're already this far." James shook his head. "That's exactly why it stops here." Fat leaned back, studying him. "You know what that means, right? If we erase it now, there's no turning back." James nodded. "I know." "Aren't you afraid of him?" Fat asked. "After everything he's done?" James answered immediately. "Yes." The honesty in that single word unsettled Fat. "But fear isn't a reason to become someone I hate," James continued. "If I use this against him, I'll never escape him." Fat exhaled slowly. "You're choosing him over justice." "No," James corrected. "I'm choosing not to become his executioner." Outside, Hoan pressed his back against the wall. His eyes closed as if struck. Each word cut deeper than accusation ever could. "I owe him too much," James said. "Not obedience, not silence, just this." Fat hesitated, fingers hovering above the keyboard. "Once it's gone, it's gone." James met his eyes. "Do it." A final pause. Then Fat clicked. Outside, Hoan felt his knees weaken. The decision he feared had arrived, and not as punishment, but as mercy. And mercy, he realized, was far heavier than judgment. Hoan stepped back from the window slowly, carefully, as if the ground beneath his feet might betray him. The faint light from inside the house no longer reached his face. He stood there for a moment, frozen, listening to the muffled sounds of movement inside, but the conversation had ended. He did not knock. The decision settled heavily in his chest. His shadow stretched long across the dirt path as he turned away from the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of age, but because something inside him had finally cracked. The cane in his hand dragged lightly along the ground, leaving a thin line behind, uneven and broken. Hoan stopped under the dim outline of a tree. His breathing grew shallow. He pressed a hand against his chest, fingers trembling, as if trying to steady a heart that no longer obeyed him. "So this is what it costs," he whispered, barely audible even to himself. The house behind him remained quiet, warm, alive. A place where he was no longer needed, no longer feared, no longer obeyed. For years, power had been his language, control his shield. He had believed authority was the same as protection. Standing here now, alone in the fading light, he understood how wrong he had been. He had not raised a son who needed commands. He had raised a son strong enough to walk away from him. Hoan swallowed hard. His vision blurred briefly, and he had to steady himself against the tree. A sharp thought pierced through the haze. If this continued, he would lose James forever. Not to prison, not to revenge, but to truth. He straightened slowly, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and turned toward the dark road ahead. For the first time, retreat did not feel like strategy. It felt like defeat. Hoan walked away from the house without looking back. The light from the window remained behind him, steady and unmoving, while his own figure dissolved into the darkness of the path. Each step felt unbalanced, as if his body were struggling to keep pace with his thoughts. The words he had overheard repeated themselves in his mind, slow and relentless. They did not accuse him. They did not threaten him. That was what made them unbearable. He had always believed silence was strength, secrets were armor, truth was a liability. Tonight, for the first time, those beliefs felt hollow. His breathing grew heavier as he reached the end of the road. He stopped, leaning forward slightly, one hand gripping the cane, the other pressed firmly against his chest. A sharp pain flared, then faded, leaving behind a warning he could not ignore. "I'm old," he murmured, not as a complaint, as a realization. If he continued like this, hiding behind power and fear, his heart would not endure it. Worse than that, his son would not. James had already suffered enough. Hoan closed his eyes. A single thought rose above the chaos, clear and unavoidable. He had to tell the truth, not to save himself, not to erase the past, but because love, delayed too long, still demanded a voice. When he opened his eyes, the house was no longer visible. Only the night remained, vast and silent, waiting. Hoan straightened his back and moved forward, toward a confession he could no longer escape. An aging father arrives at his son's modest home and stops outside, hiding in silence. Through an open window, he overhears a conversation that slowly dismantles his authority. Evidence exists that could send him to prison, and the decision rests entirely with his son. As the discussion unfolds, the father realizes his son is no longer fearful or submissive, but calm and resolute. The son acknowledges his father's crimes, yet refuses to destroy him. Choosing conscience over revenge, he orders the evidence erased. Listening from the shadows, the father experiences fear, shame, and collapse. He retreats without revealing himself, understanding that control has cost him everything. Walking away into the night, he accepts his age, his mistakes, and the truth he must finally confess, before losing his son forever and facing consequences that can no longer be delayed or denied.